Okay, ooh, sparse. I got about 17 on right now.
Professor, I think Alex still has my phone.
That's fine. Hold on a second. Give me just 1 second, everybody. Excuse me. Okay, so everybody, thank you all so much for joining us here. I know y'all enjoyed your week off last week, or just hope you did. This is PA 509, Applied Political Economy, Class 6. And tonight will be our part one of a couple of parts that we'll be talking about with respect to constraints on good governance. Really talking about why is it that government ends up achieving the results or lack thereof of various policy, or why does it do things that seem to not benefit society in general and actually seem to hurt society. Certainly a lot of examples are given in the text, and certainly a lot of other examples that we could talk about if you would like. So let's talk about, we're going to start off, I just want to give some time for open discussion if there's any amongst the class. If there's anything anybody wants to talk about, do that for a few minutes, then we'll get to the assigned reading. Obviously, we're talking about two different elements. There's an introduction that I'm also going to go over first with respect to strategic adjustment, and then talk about dynamic inconsistency. I do have some time set aside for a class exercise from some of the problems later on. I think it's in chapter 8. And then we'll talk about the assignments for week 7, which will be next week on March 3rd. So what I'll do now is, if there's anybody who has anything they want to say or bring up or anything, and it can be about just about anything. I'm not trying to get out of lecturing, I promise you that, but I just wanted to give people a chance if they had some questions with respect to any assignments or just any topics in general and how they may relate to what we're dealing with. Be happy to talk about it this time. So if anybody wants to, the floor is open.
Well,
yes.
The economic fallout from what's going on in Russia is kind of important to what we're talking about.
It is just for the audience, if they didn't have a chance to hear, question was brought up with respect to the economic fallout of the situation in Russia. Well, actually, the situation in Ukraine that's been created by Russia's invasion of them overnight. It's really interesting. It's funny. This afternoon, the primary indexes for the stock market were all down. Oil was over 100. We're down several hundred points. Oil was up above $100 a barrel, and somehow before close, stocks actually achieved a positive for the day. They were up about 90-something points. Oil was back down to $90-something a barrel. So what happened? And all I can say is that if you had a chance to listen to President Biden's speech this afternoon, he did not go to DEFCON 1. For those familiar with the old DEFCON system, DEFCON 1 being war, he did not go to DEFCON 1 on sanctions. Did not say anything about eliminating Russia's ability to export oil or natural gas, which in itself is a challenging situation, more so for Europe, but is also for us because we import several 100,000 barrels of oil a day in net from Russia, but a much more significant issue to Europe because of the fact that they have engineered a focus on renewables, which are great sometimes of the year, but not great during the winter. And they're still in the winter, and their winters last a little bit longer than ours. So the end result is that it was some people, I guess the markets were thinking that with this invasion that we were going to go from a very light sanction package, very targeted sanction package that was introduced earlier this week, and basically go full bore and go into a basically shutdown type of sanction package and basically try to cut off their economy completely. That's not what we did. We basically just notched up the sanction package, which either means, because at the end of the day, there was a lot of debate for the last couple of weeks about the reliability of U.S. intelligence with respect to what was going on with Russian forces in Ukraine, generally speaking, a lot of people felt there were a lot of people, because of questions about U.S. intelligence over the last 25 years, were thinking they're not right. This is not as significant of an issue as it was. If that means, since the intelligence was correct, it means that this has probably been the White House strategy all along. In other words, they probably were thinking this invasion is going to happen. Ukraine is not a NATO member nation. They want to be a NATO member nation. We have not provided that. That is a major concern of Russia because Russia does not want that large of a NATO member nation on their border. They do not have nuclear weapons anymore. They lost their, if you remember, Soviets had nuclear weapons. Some of them were in Ukraine. When Ukraine broke off, Ukraine said, you know what, we really don't want these around anymore. We got rid of them. So there's a situation where Russia has a military advantage because in the world, even though this is not the world that many of y'all lived in, or maybe some attending this class who remember the Cold War, I remember the end of it. But the reality is nuclear weapons are still nuclear weapons. So at the end of the day, they can still cause a lot of problems, and they are still a very effective piece of arsenal to have when you're trying to play this kind of game. And unfortunately, this is what we're dealing with. And so it kind of gets into some of the discussions with respect to strategic adjustment. You can kind of look at that example that was provided in text with respect to counterterrorism and also apply it to this example. In that you can be a tyrannical despot like Putin and still be a very calculating human being. It's possible to be rational and ruthless at the same time. And the reality is that he's made certain calculations and he's fully aware, I believe, of what we know because he can't hide anything. He's not trying to hide anything because we have far more advanced intelligence capabilities than he does. He has more advanced cyber attack capabilities than we do, but we have much more advanced intelligence capabilities. And so the only thing that kept this from happening sooner is the fact that the Winter Olympics ended this weekend. And for those of you who know anything about history, there's something known as the Olympic truce. And that nations aren't supposed to go to war against each other during an Olympics. So basically he waited for that to be over for the pseudo-Russian delegation to get out of China, even though they're friends now with China, and proceed to move forward with his plan. So basically he was just waiting for a predetermined time, which he predetermined. Everything happened basically the way the intelligence people said it happened. So what we have right now is a situation where there's a tendency for people in business investing to try to weigh these risks preemptively. It's called trying to, the phrase is it's baked into the cake, as they like to say in business investing, to try to assume certain things are going to happen in the future. This kind of gets into the timing aspect with respect to dynamic inconsistency. The problem is that we just don't know how much has been determined. What we do know is that we have a full-scale military invasion of a nation that did not provoke it. It is a violation of international law, and there are real human casualties. And so the real question at this point is what will happen next, and I simply don't know. But I will say, based on how it applies to public policy, one example is obviously we're municipal government, state governments, federal government are huge consumers of fuel. That's how we keep most of our operations going. We got to get around, and we're huge consumers of fuel. This puts us in a position where we have to think about, I don't see supply disruption being an issue. We all experienced that a year ago due to a fluke because of a pipeline explosion. I don't see supply disruption being an issue. What I do see is prices going up. Prices are already up. They were already up probably because of escalation of this, also because domestic production is down, and domestic use has increased as we have moved out of the pandemic phase. So those are recipes for significantly higher prices based on the work that I did today for my job are at the same level that we haven't seen since 2014. So they are significantly higher. Here in North Carolina, around $3.50 a gallon, if not more. Prices increased 10 cents a gallon locally in Rocky Mount today. I can buy gas at Sam's Club, and when I was over at Sam's Club 2 o'clock this afternoon, I couldn't get into Sam's Club because the lines were back. I wasn't trying to get gas, but there were lines already backed up to try to get gas. So people are aware, people are naturally going to respond behaviorally to situations and are going to do what people do. And obviously that's going to create further demand, especially in the short term. And that's, of course, going to be probably one of the biggest impacts. There are other commodities. A lot of the challenges will be commodity based because there is a significant amount of commodity activity where Russia is either an exporter to the United States or because Russia is an exporter to other parts of the world that has a significant share of global supply, which makes other sources of supply more valuable. And that's, of course, going to have an effect. You probably heard, if you read anything about the farming industry, they've seen dramatic increases in the cost of fertilizers and other materials that are used in commercial or even small scale, but especially large scale farming. Those, of course, didn't get factored into the price for actual crops and produce. Yes.
I can't remember if I'm incorrect, but doesn't Russia export, I mean, it might be Ukraine, some kind of chips that are used in like phones and pretty much all technologies they're talking about? I read some article about that.
Go ahead. Yes, Shannon.
Sorry, we've been talking about this a lot in my other classes, but they export neon, which is used in the lasers that then help chips for the smart chips that go into cars and technology right now.
And which is it, Russia or Ukraine?
It's Ukraine.
Okay, that makes sense. Ukraine's advantage, and it's funny that they talked about it a couple of weeks ago, but it's a reminder, Ukraine has a lot of resources. It has a lot of natural resources. And the Russians over time in history have been, and I'm talking about the government. I want to be very clear. When I talk about these terms generally, I am talking about the governments, the rulers, the power class. I am not talking about the citizenry or the people in general, because in the case of Russia, the Russian people really have no say in this because Russia is basically a de facto dictatorship. Same can be said about a lot of other countries. So I want to make that very clear. In fact, there are a lot of Russians who have been actively protesting against this in the last several hours, and they have no freedom of speech in Russia. That does not exist. So it's a very challenging situation. The other thing that comes up about chips, just to remind you, is that 90% of the chips that are produced in the world, or close to 90%, are produced in Taiwan. Taiwan has its own issues because of China, and so those have to be considered as well. But a good point about with respect to neon, those types of resources that do exist out there, those natural resources that are part of a lot of even modern manufacturing processes or in more traditional production, are very essential. And so there's a lot to deal with there. But I've recommended for us that we go into fuel conservation. So from a budgetary perspective, and we'll probably be doing that next week. And that's going to be a challenge. In case you're wondering, it's very hard for governments necessarily to go hybrid, for small governments to go to hybrids, because there are issues with maintenance and issues with compatibility and such. We get into electrification, to full electrification, it's even more challenging, but it is a direction that we'll be going because of other developments that happen, but it's just not, but we have to deal with the situation as it currently sits. So anybody else want to add anything, say anything, share anything? It doesn't even have to be about this topic.
Oh, I don't mind adding. It's not, I mean, it's sort of related in that we are being advised about heightened security risks, cybersecurity attacks, and not only from Russian and Ukraine actors, but others who will take advantage of the circumstance. I had to brief folks today on an Iranian situation that threatens. And of course, a lot of these may lead to ransomware attacks that could have impacts on the economy.
Right, absolutely. There was an article today in Triangle Business Journal that dealt directly with that. And that's the reality, is that it's not just that in today's international environment, simply what would 70 or 80 years ago be thought of as a two-party situation, where basically it would be Russia versus Ukraine, and the question everybody else would be around is what is our interest, direct interest, i.e. what's our interest in Ukraine, or what's our interest in Russia? In today's world, these types of circumstances, these types of conflicts have international global consequences. And not just economic. Cybersecurity clearly is a concern, especially when you think about some of the more vulnerable targets include hospitals, electric grids, all kinds of infrastructure, both physical infrastructure and human capital infrastructure that are essential to society function. And we know Ukraine has some actors in their country. Russia endorses it basically and uses it as a proxy force. We also have other countries around the world, and yes, there are some even here in the United States, even though we do try to catch them and find them. So there is a lot of concern in that area. I know somebody who deals with that a lot. They're not a programmer, but they do advise companies on cybersecurity, and they're watching this very closely. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
What's like the motivation for increased cybersecurity risks right now with the Russian?
What's the motivation?
Yeah.
So the best way to describe it, and anybody else chime in, is the blood in the water. Is the concept of blood in the water. Sharks, get attracted to blood in the water, and we deal in a circumstance where it's that. And this has happened before. This happens a lot throughout history. That when conflict starts in one area, it automatically rises up defense. And what it does is that it draws attention and draws resources and draws focus to the area that's being attacked. And what it does is that it creates weakness on the backside. So give you an example of what happened. I mean, to give just purely military example. 2 to 3 days ago, Putin announces the independence of 2 Ukrainian states that have been involved, where he's been sponsoring separatists to fight in these areas over the last couple of years. The Ukrainians advance forces up to those areas to try to be ready to respond to attacks. Putin and his forces basically cut them from underneath. Basically flank them and then roll in. I mean, it was the first time I've seen in a very long time that kind of tactical response, because they kind of lost favor with the whole concept of mechanized warfare. But the reality is that if you're somebody who's an opportunist to engage in some kind of behavior, the best time to attack is when everybody else is attacking. Particularly in something like cybersecurity, where and any professional, knowledgeable, good cybersecurity professional will tell you, it is virtually impossible to prevent all attacks or to stop all attacks from having an impact. Most systems, like the NC State system, are hit thousands, if not hundreds of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times. Most people aren't aware of that. And simply just pile on. It's pile on. And so when somebody comes forward and creates it, some people can use that as a diversion. So that's something that has to be thought of. I mean, it's the reason why a lot of people have already said, okay, we're focused on Russia, so is China going to do anything with Taiwan? They sent 2 of their fighter jets to Taiwanese airspace today, which they do on a regular occasion, but it's kind of like, okay, what's the timing? So that's something we have to be aware of. Anybody else?
And I'll just add, 'cause I think you gave a very good explanation, but if
Yeah.
they can shut, it's just part of the arsenal now. in a conflict. They don't have to aim a bomb or a tank at a utility grid to shut down that municipality or that county or that state or whatever it may be that they want to attack. They can do that by hacking into the mechanism, the computer system that's keeping all those utilities up and running. We've already seen that the Ukrainian government's website has been attacked, and that's so that they can't disseminate information to the people. But it's also, I mean, just like we've issued sanctions, it's a way to, come back at countries that have issued sanctions and try to attack them as well. But then there's just bad actors that are taking advantage of the situation.
Right, absolutely. Does anybody got anything else they would like to share? Okay. Well, I think it was a good conversation. I thank y'all for indulging us for a few minutes. So I want to begin by kind of looking a little bit at the introduction to part 3, Constraints on Good Governance, which page 193. There were a couple of concepts that I felt like deserved some attention in this, and I know that I signed chapters. I might assume that some of y'all did read the introductions to each part, but it wasn't assigned necessarily. But the author really talks here about the fact that in reality, and this is the case everywhere, this is not just the case in the United States or in any particular locality. This is a global issue, regardless of what politicians say. That the reality is that that there's kind of a mental tendency for us to focus on maybe not the public at large or everybody that we serve, but at a constituency. I see this with city councils and county commissions all the time. And it's because that's how politicians in most cases are rewarded. Because it's important to remember that when there's an election, not everybody votes. We don't want mandatory voting because we don't want to force people to vote. But what it also means that in an electoral system, it's not the public as a whole that you're trying to convince, or trying to persuade. It's those who are going to vote, or those who you can convince to vote. And so it's only natural to kind of drill down to that group and say, what is it that I can do for that group that'll benefit from it? And then if you want to take it to perhaps a less ethical perspective, those who can help me obtain power through donations or through access or whatever the case may be, what is it that they want? And it leads to this concept known as rent seeking, which is talked about in the first page. And he says, rent seeking is using policy to benefit particular individuals or groups. And you can look at the multitude of policy that actually gets implemented. And most of it, and a lot of people talk about this, most of it gets tied back to rent seeking. That it does not benefit society as a whole. It is not necessarily what's good for everybody, but it's good for particular people. Now, this can be positive. It can also be necessary. That's not to say that I'm not here to say rent seeking is evil, but it is the reality, and it has potential. And of course, it does create the issue of it does help. It does lead to even greater externalities. It exacerbates externalities that would exist with just normal general policy, but it also is meant to try to achieve certain outcomes. Talks in here a lot about one of the more glaring examples of rent seeking in the United States, and that is the sugar industry. It is one of the commodity industries in the United States that makes absolutely no sense. And that's because the policies that are in place, which are advocated for politicians, this was one of the things that hurt Marco Rubio's presidential campaign in 2016. Because he had connections to the sugar industry, is the fact that the sugar industry, the domestic sugar industry, has a lot of sway and influence in American politics at a national level. And as a result, is able to have policies that are very favorable to them and make absolutely no sense when you think about the fact that pretty much all other food commodities that we get in the United States, with the exception of milk, which is another one, are imported. We import fruits and vegetables, we import meat, though we have some issues with that. We import fish, we import just about everything else, except for milk and sugar. And as a result, the prices for those are significantly higher than they should be in an open market. And that policy is not good for everybody. It is only good for those particular cases. We have an interest that's been around for a long time, particularly in the Midwest, to try to protect the dairy industry. And then we have an interest down in Florida and maybe a few other places, but primarily in Florida, to protect the sugar industry. And in those are prime examples of rent seeking. It is beneficial to them, certainly. It is very beneficial to them. But as he talks about, it's not beneficial to everybody. And in a lot of ways, it's hurtful. Which gets to my point here, and this is not in the book, but I say it, all policy is political. If you work in any level of government and you work on developing policy, there's going to be a point, even as you're going through formal analysis, as you're going through appropriate evaluation, as you're looking at it from a scientific perspective, as you're using those methods and approaches, at some point, there is going to be there is going to be a intersection with politics. It may work out okay, and a few times it does, but it's very rare. And normally there has to be a lot of consideration that leads to constraints on what is possible by simply applying scientific or reason-based policy in a more ideal environment. What we're going to talk about this week and next couple of weeks really are that there are two broad understandings that we have of these constraints. The first is technological. And that's pretty simple. He talks about it on page 195. That when a technical constraint, a factor in the world that limits even well-intentioned ability to achieve good outcomes. This could be an issue with respect to changing people's behavior, limited commitment powers, as well as lack of information. Those are more natural limits. Those are more natural cases. For example, green energy is a great policy with respect that it's primarily the idea of being renewable and being more self-contained, which reduces distribution, reduces security issues and all that. The problem is trying to advance the technology and the science of it, even with significant investments made and a significant amount of focus made, is proving to be quite a challenge. In part because of the laws of physics, in part because there's just a lot of technical challenges. And we've been working on it for a reasonable amount of time. We can talk about other factors that contribute to it, but there are certain technological challenges. The other one, when it comes to incentives, you're talking about features of the politics of the policymaking process that affect the policymaker's interests. It's very easy to, and I'll just say this, it's very easy when you are a policymaker or a policy developer, that as you're moving your idea towards the finish line and trying to make it a reality, to accept that there are going to be influences that you're not going to be able to control, and to find ways to incorporate them into your policy, into your action. That's very simple, very natural. You're trying to find some degree of compromise and consensus to get done what it is you want to get done. It is also possible that those influences can undermine policy. And that happens much as well. I think I talked a little bit before with respect to opportunity zones, which was developed during the Trump administration as an economic development tool for distressed urban areas. And the reality was that the design of those was heavily influenced in a way that they kind of undermined the ability for them to be truly effective. They were also undermined with respect to the selection process and the way that the guidance was written. It's a program that overall has had negligible effect on true redevelopment in the areas in which they were meant to serve. But again, as the author talks about, this should not dissuade you from wanting to go into this. I realize in the course of this study, it seems like every time we turn around, it's like one more reason not to do anything. But the reality is that there is a lot that can be done, and there are ways to do it. And what's really important is that you understand how the process works so that you're able to achieve the best results possible. So first, we're going to talk about strategic adjustment. So who wants to go over for me and for the class the example that the author provides about CAFE standards?
So this is the idea that like the government sets these fuel economy standards, and there's certain, the technical stuff didn't make sense, but there's certain like classifications of certain cars that are and are not in it. And so basically the idea of, okay, we're going to regulate certain ones and bring that down, but the auto industry kind of like shifted in the way they classified it. So it ended up being that SUVs came, which is like the worst thing in the world.
Well, they're not the worst thing, but they're close. I can understand from the fuel efficiency standpoint they are, but so after the oil embargoes and the subsequent gasoline crises of the early 70s, the government took a step. It was also done with respect to other concerns to establish national guidelines for fuel efficiency in automobiles. The joke was always that things used to be measured in gallons per mile. I had my first vehicle was a 1976 Ford F-150. I think I got 9 miles per gallon with that vehicle, based on how long I could drive it with a 20-gallon tank. So the reality is that they recognized that when they did it, ideally, the goal would have been to try to have a standard that achieved goals and did it in a way that was as universal as possible. To try to have a singular standard, to try to have as few standards as possible with as little wiggle room as possible for them. Naturally, that was not going to happen. Particularly because if you've ever studied the auto industry in the 1970s, the U.S. was not making anything smaller than was not making anything small. Almost all the small cars were either being made in Europe or being made in Japan. And so that was what led to that, and quality, that and also advanced quality matters is what led to tremendous import of automobiles from these parts of the world and the loss of U.S. market share. The U.S. can build one thing very well. We can build a truck better than anybody. We've been doing it for a long time, and a lot of people like to drive trucks. And so they realized, and so certain provisions were made with the understanding that for a long time, trucks were not for everyone. The reason I had that truck was that my grandfather was a building contractor. It was his old truck. He gave it to me when he bought a new one. And my father drove a truck, but he drove a small pickup truck. He drove a Ford Ranger. He drove small trucks because he wanted he wanted better gas mileage. He just needed something for stuff around the house. But in the early to mid 1990s, the auto industry had an epiphany. And what they saw was, well, we don't have to just make trucks. We can also make other kinds of vehicles. And and so they decided to come up with this idea that one of the complaints people had about cars was that they were too small, they didn't have enough space, particularly if you had more than 2 kids. I mean, you can fit 5 people into a sedan, but is it really comfortable? No. So they said, let's come up with something different. And so they came up with the idea of saying, let's use truck chassis, not car chassis. Just use truck chassis and let's build larger vehicles like minivans and of course sport utility vehicles. Which they then found out, hey, that gets around fuel mileage standards. So we can reorient our fleet to sell these vehicles, which there was consumer demand for when they made them available. And make it to where more people have trucks. And oh, by the way, we don't have to make them with small engines. They can have decent engines so they can get up to 70 miles an hour on the highway. Of course, the impact of that was that these vehicles had much lower fuel standards. And as a result, the standards that had been set in place for fuel efficiency dropped dramatically. Now, there was some corrective action taken on it. And what that led was to decisions that were made in more recent years where the US auto industry basically decided, we're not going to make sedans. And that decision occurred, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, where Ford and GM and Chrysler all said, you know what, we don't make any money on sedans, the margin on them is small, nobody really wants them, they would rather have an import, they'd rather have a foreign plate, since most of the foreign cars are now made here domestically, but we're not going to make them anymore. They've kind of now come forward and say, oh, by the way, these truck chassis can also handle a lot of batteries. So that's why I bought a Toyota Venza, which is Toyota's mid-level SUV this past fall. It's a hybrid, got a 10-gallon gas tank, which is nice for me right now. Gets decent mileage. That's what they decided to do. So, and of course, that's why these auto companies are now looking at ways to build electric pickup trucks and stuff like that. So they get there in a certain way, but not exactly the way it's intended. And certainly there are negative outcomes as a result of it. There's some other examples that are given, but at the end of the day, the reality is that in any situation where the government is engaging in policy or any kind of action, the reality is that you are always going to have limited resources. Whether it be water production, the resources necessary for waste disposal, public safety, whatever the case is, you're always going to have limited resources. So that's number one. Number two is that there's a tendency in human nature that people don't just respond as intended. One of the challenges that we continue to see in this is that we're dealing with human behavior. And human behavior can rationally or irrationally adapt and respond differently than what's intended. So it's hard to predict human behavior. There's a branch, there's a study in economics, and it's preferred by libertarians known as praxeology. And it tries to look at the real behavior of humans and trying to basically say what their goal when they talk about it is basically say, don't try to predict human behavior. It's not worth your time. You're never going to be able to predict it. Move on. Not saying that that's true, but there are people out there who say it. So when we're looking at strategic adjustment, there are a lot of ways that we can look at it because people will adapt and there's only so many resources available in a given situation. And the first example that it talks about is this concept of strategic adversaries. And it's important because there are situations, and that's what's kind of being dealt with right now between the situation in terms from an external perspective. The US is currently in an external perspective with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to figure out how do we deploy our resources in a way to achieve our objectives. Our primary objective in this case is to simply stop the intervention. In this case, in this book, it gives two examples, one being counterterrorism, which we've been actively involved in, and talks about going all the way back to the 1970s. And then, and of course, more so, and most of y'all know this very well, since September 11th of 2001, and then also the war on drugs. And so really what it says here is, it's pretty straightforward, and it says here on page 199, the probability that an attack against a given target succeeds depends on the counterterrorism resources devoted to protect the target. Not going to get into the math on this, but theoretically, the more resources that you provide to deal with a threat or an adversary, the less likely the probability of their success. But there's one problem with probability. Anybody tell me what that problem is? Online, in person, anybody? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think we both talked about how you end up spreading yourself too thin as a government.
Yes.
And then talked about either your, well, it said that you're defending both sides, and then a bunch of formulas that I can't explain.
not asking you to do that, because you'll never
I
use it.
just wanted to contribute.
No, you're absolutely right. One, you can spread yourself too thin, but that's not, I mean, that's certainly true. And that is a limitation. The other reality is you can never draw that probability down to zero. The one thing to keep in mind in probability is that there's always a chance. As was said, as was often been said when you're dealing with adversarial situations, your adversary only has to get right once. And that's the challenge. And in counterterrorism, the probability is there, and what you're trying to do is create this concept of zero. Zero has become this big thing. We have this talk about carbon zero, and we have this conversation about having zero pedestrian fatalities. That's a big movement in the surface transportation industry. There's, of course, places around the world that try to advance COVID zero. And they weren't going to have anybody die of COVID. And the reality is that when you actually look at the theoretics of math and when you understand probability, you cannot eliminate all probability. In no situation can you do that. So the only probability that's zero is that you're going to live forever. I think they said it differently in Fight Club, but you get the idea. But the reality is that there is no circumstance, as I said before, where probability goes to zero. But you also have the ability to maximize the probability on the other side. But the chances are you can't get it to 1-to-1 either. So it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And you can look at, there's also the fact that there's also, and it doesn't talk as much in this, but there is also a diminishing returns issue with respect to the amount of resources you put into a given circumstance. For example, with counterterrorism, in the 1960s, 1970s, there was absolutely no security in an airport. You may have a couple of police officers walking around to help you or somebody's distressed, but there was absolutely no security, which means that I could get on an airplane, and this happened a lot. I could get on an airplane, say that I have a bomb, even if I don't have one, as was the case with several terrorists who were somewhat successful. And in a lot of cases, what these people wanted was they wanted the flight diverted somewhere, they wanted the cash ransom, or whatever the case may be. So the initial response is, well, we got to protect the airplane. We got to make sure that they aren't able to get on the airplane. So they did the logical thing. They created a process or a policy to be able to prevent that from happening as much as possible. So they instituted the idea of putting metal detectors at the gate and having some kind of search to try to catch it. And it worked very well. It was a simple solution, not an incredibly expensive solution, and it did have a significant impact on deterrence. So an example of taking the low-hanging fruit. Then, as time went on, we started upgrading these policies and these practices because there were greater concerns about, well, people can get through with non-metallic items. That's what we saw with the Pan Am bombing in 1986 or 1988, I can't remember which year, but the Pan Am bombing was a situation where the terrorists used a very intricate device and were able to evade the security screening systems in Europe's airports to basically facilitate the detonation of a device in midair. So they changed the policies to include, bag scanners and all other kinds of technology. And then we had 9/11, where the terrorists used very simplistic weapons to be able to take control of aircraft, which led to even vaster, more considerable. Before September 11th, you could walk up to the gate without a ticket. As you know, I could go when my spouse would fly home, I would meet her at the gate, being the sensible gentleman that I am. And of course, now you can't get past the gate. You can't even get past security. And in most places, they finally worked it out where it's reasonably efficient, but it's far more in-depth, far more physical labor involved, far more. And the costs continue to escalate at significantly higher levels. But what you're really doing is you're significantly reducing the gap in probability that you're saving and trying to prevent the event. Yes.
Do you know if all of those are those annual allocations funding for the increasing security in airports, is that considered spending or is that in a different category?
It's Homeland Security spending. And whether it's coming directly from the federal government or it's coming from fees you pay to get on an airplane, it's kind of a hybrid in that. The airlines were kind of like, the airline's concern is we don't want to be the ones responsible for paying it. You want to charge it as a surcharge, that's fine. We don't want to pay for it. We don't want to pay for it directly. That would be considered Homeland Security. And prior to 2001, that was an airport responsibility. The services were kind of disjointed, and now it's all part of a federal agency known as TSA. Everybody's favorite agency. So we continue to have, and generally speaking, if you look at what's going on in the United States, with the exception of cybersecurity, which is an ongoing challenge, we've been reasonably successful in preventing terrorist attacks. But the amount of capital and financial resources it takes to address that is considerable and only continues to grow as time moves on. So we've had success, but still the outcome, the reality is there will be a time, unfortunately, when something does happen. That's the reality. And when that happens, there will be a massive reconsideration of what should we have done, how we could have prevented it, all those types of things. And the question, and then it'll come to, well, how do we make another investment to prevent this from happening? And the reality is we just don't. But we've made considerable progress. On the flip side, we have the war on drugs. So does somebody online want to talk to us a little bit about what was really going on with the war on drugs, what the example in the book is about?
Yeah, I can take a crack at it.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So the war on drugs was people were coming in from the Caribbean and selling drugs through Florida. So then the government created a policy initiative to crack down on that. So what ended up happening was, yes, they were successful and that they stopped drugs from coming in through the Caribbean through Florida, but then it opened up that backdoor channel through Mexico, where now Mexico has become the scene of drug cartels, and it's all coming in through Texas and stuff now.
Absolutely. I'm not going to go into particulars of this. There's plenty of documentary movies you can watch about it to do a far better job than I do. Yes, Curtis.
I was just going to continue on. She had hit it right on the head.
Okay, is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I thought she was gonna continue on and talk about how Kleiman had the suggestion on how to fix it, that's all.
Okay, why don't you, well, let me talk for a second and I'll let you say that, okay? So basically here, we have a policy that achieves its initial intended outcome, but doesn't achieve its actual outcome. Because again, people adapt to it. There's a natural adaptation to it, okay? We can't get it across the water using airplanes flying from Central America to Florida. We will find other ways of bringing it in, and we just figure out, oh yeah, we'll just go through Mexico. Curtis, what was it you want to add?
His goal was to not necessarily go after the drugs, but go after the violent drug gangs. And by going after the most violent drug gangs, you would actually reduce not necessarily the drugs, but the amount of homicides and violent offenses that went around it.
Okay, so you're a law enforcement professional.
Yes, sir.
What is your opinion with respect to that suggestion?
I don't know if that's the worst of the two evils. You know, you talked about earlier, there was the second option is often the better option, because like she said, you're not going to stop the drugs from coming in. Somebody's going to find a way. When you have open borders, as long as you have water, you can't secure thousands and thousands of coastal miles. So the only thing you can do is hope to reduce the amount of violence and everything else associated with it.
Okay, good point. Clearly, the U.S., in a focused effort that goes back to the early 70s, seems like all these things start, but maybe, has been trying to deal with the fact there is a significant appetite for drugs in this country, and for illegal drugs. We'll talk about illegal drugs here. We can get into other stuff later, but there's a significant appetite for illegal drugs. A lot of it's imported, and the concern is, well, how do we stop the supply? Because the people that are involved in the processing of this aren't very nice themselves. And the initial thought was, let's focus on supply. And as we can see, that in itself is a major challenge. Particularly with the fact that there are significant challenges that the government's faced with, that our governments to the south of us, in this case, faced with stability. But that's true also in other parts of the world. We've seen that in Asia with respect to heroin. We've seen that in other parts of the world with respect to other drugs. It does make sense that, okay, we're not going to focus on, if we're having those troubles, let's focus on focusing on the people who are involved in the distribution of those drugs here domestically. Again, it's an illegal enterprise, so it's typically aligned with people who are already involved in illegal activity. What are some of the challenges that we face if we choose to focus resources more in that direction?
On the drug aspect? Like,
Yes. If we focus on gangs, as SALT is provided here, if we focus more on gangs, what are the potential challenges there?
well, it depends what gangs you're focusing on, because for Mexico's instance, there's so many different cartels that you have to identify which ones that you want to go after. And then if you take out, if you deconstruct one cartel, there's 10 more that can take their place. So it gets very complicated in terms
There's
of
a further spreading, a further thinning of the situation. You're dealing with far more adversaries than you are dealing with import-export type activity. There are many players, but it's still a smaller group of players than there are in terms of dealing with, on a domestic situation, in terms of people that are involved in supply. So let's say you go from 10 to 100, or from 100 to 1,000, or whatever the case may be. There's also the issue that we have in that you have to have the resources for that, and it also becomes much more, it can become much more challenging. Let's now talk about incentivizing of multiple tasks. And what we're really talking here from page 206, how do we create incentives for achieving an outcome that requires multiple inputs when some of the inputs are better measured than others? And it gives an excellent, it talks, basically, this is the easiest way to focus this is on our focus on educational performance. Good point, Bree. We have this focus on outcome, or what we consider outcome measures of educational performance. And how do we typically look at educational performance in this country? What are some examples? Yes. Standardized test scores. What else? Yes. Well, that was a tool that we used for it, but we're looking for measurements. Yes.
Graduation rates?
Yeah, exactly. Graduation rates. So you have test scores, you have graduation rates, you have grade point averages. You can get even more finite when you're looking at particular school districts, and you can find out information about where these kids get accepted to college and what's the dropout rate and all of those types of things. So these are various outcome-based measurements that we have that look at in-product results of educational performance. We can get a little more into the weeds when we start looking at like reading proficiency scores and math proficiency scores. That's how we're evaluated internationally. We're evaluated internationally on the basis of proficiency in very select subjects. And generally speaking, the last couple of generations, we've been on the short end of the stick in terms of our performance compared to a lot of other parts of the industrialized world. So the reality is, of course, it becomes a big policy focus to try to find ways to improve these metrics, because that's how we know to measure. And so we spend a lot of money. The US spends a considerable amount of money on public education at the youth level. And it's a combination of federal money, state money, and local money in most jurisdictions, most parts of the country. And the goals and objectives are pretty much that we want youth to reach a certain threshold of performance by a certain time, so they can generally be prepared, and there's differing opinions about this, but generally be prepared to take on jobs and be self-sufficient in the future, whether they choose to go through college or they choose to go through a technical trade field in a different fashion. So he looks at it from the perspective of a teacher, in this case, his sister. And I know we may have some teachers in this audience. What are some of the multiple inputs that these teachers are having that you can imagine, or that you know that these teachers deal with in terms of the challenges they have to try to achieve this given outcome? Yes.
No, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
No, go ahead.
But I'm just thinking about sort of the standardized testing
Mhm.
issue, where like you already know that your high performing kids are going to succeed on the test, and your lower performing kids are going to fail the test. So you just sort of focus on this middle group,
Right.
and so you're leaving these other people behind because you have this test to focus on. You want to succeed.
Right. The concept when these programs were developed, the No Child Left Behind Act came along in the early 2000s. Grand example of bipartisan legislation. It was actually the brainchild of Edward Kennedy, or Edward Kennedy's staff. And George W. Bush latched onto it, saw it as an opportunity to create bipartisanship after the 2000 election. So they passed it through. What No Child Left Behind is that it nationalized concepts that had been applied by several states starting in the 1980s. One of them was my home state of Tennessee. And the idea was that we needed to have a system of evaluation for educational performance that not only would evaluate on the basis of of achieving a certain standard, but would also incorporate continuous improvement. So whether it was through incentivizing teacher training to encourage teachers to go from getting bachelor degrees to master's degrees and master's degrees to doctoral degrees, whether it was through the promotion of standardized teaching methods, and of course, the application of standardized tests. The idea was that they could figure out a formula that could be a model that could be facilitated to enable educational performance to improve overall. The model, of course, had some challenges to it, and it gets back to people adapting. As you brought up properly, you have a teacher that's looking at a situation of that they're being evaluated based on overall performance. They're being looked at in terms of the performance of the whole. Depending on the class that they're teaching, that is a challenge for them, because if you're performing in a high-performing school, like say some of the specialty schools we have here in Wake County, where these are select schools for the most part, or they're schools where the parents are involved, and the parents are providing stable household environments, and so on and so forth. You can basically go into that situation and try to make everybody improve and everything will be fine. If you're dealing with a more general high school, where the possibility is that you have students from different backgrounds, with different socioeconomic challenges, different family dynamics, that becomes a lot harder. We know, based on research, that a lot of what happens outside of school influences performance inside of the school. We know that to be true. So it creates a situation where teachers have to evaluate from the standpoint of how their performance is being measured for the sake of promotion, job security, other opportunities. They have to say, what do I do to make sure that I get my numbers right? First, that leads to a change in their approach in terms of how they teach. They teach the test, as it's been called. Some of y'all are probably young enough at this point that you've experienced that firsthand. I'm old enough that I didn't. Which probably meant for some of you a rather boring academic environment when y'all were going through middle school, high school, elementary school, and so on. The other thing, obviously, as she points out, is that you have to look at your student performance and say, which students do I have the greatest potential of elevating so that I can show improvement and I can meet my necessitated benchmarks. So they're dealing with all these multiple inputs and they're having to figure out, what do I do? And so they figured out a way to do it. And at a macro level, you can achieve improved performance. But at an individual student level where it matters most, there's no guarantee. And generally speaking, when you look at the overall performance of these programs, we've been doing it now for 20 years, and there was kind of an expansion, kind of a continuation and modernization of it known as Race to the Top during the Obama administration. The reality is that the changes have been marginal. Part of that is because, again, getting back to the diminishing return, there's probably a lot that you can do to achieve some level of success at the beginning, but to continue to elevate that success over time takes a lot more resources. And again, as we talked about, resources are limited. Yes.
I was going to mention that as part of that result that you see is sometimes in those schools where they don't have those resources and they'll just pass students
Right.
so that they can have those numbers and they have a better score, they look like a better school, but then those are the students who aren't really prepared to, once they graduate high school, they have no access to resources or really to have an idea of what they want to pursue. And those are the ones who will continue to stay impoverished.
Absolutely. And that happened in Atlanta, Georgia, several years back. They were getting all of this accolade, their public school system in Atlanta, Fulton County was getting all these accolades for academic performance, when in reality, they were just doctoring the numbers. And it was a major scandal when it happened. And this is a challenge that exist. And again, it gets back to that there is, again, it kind of also gets back to the rent seeking issue. Because really, who are we trying to benefit? There are a lot of people, and they make very good points, that if you notice, there are people in private life who are very interested in education. They also happen to be major employers. And the question is, are we trying to develop these individuals, this youth, to their fullest potential as individuals, or are we simply trying to provide a labor force? And there's a lot of concern about that. And that is, there is a higher degree of nationalization and institutionalization that we've seen in our education system. It's still controlled locally for the most part. But as I was trying to explain to somebody this weekend who was asking me some questions, I said, you look at it, there's been national involvement in K-12 education now for over 60 years. And there's a considerable amount of funding, and a lot of it is attempted to be directed to those that are in the most need through Title I and other programs. And the reality is, you look at the results, it doesn't necessarily justify the cost. That's not to say that they don't need help. They need help. It's just the question is, are we doing it the right way? And as the author suggests, no, you're not really doing it, because again, you may think your concept works in theory, but in reality, people are just adapting to it. And will find a way, people will find a way to achieve the outcomes that they need to achieve in order to succeed. In this case, you put that in the hands of the teachers, and they're naturally, and this is no fault of them, no fault of them, I want to make that clear. They're doing what's in their interest to be able to succeed. So now, oh, okay, go ahead, yes.
I'm sorry, I just said additional comment on that. I think I'm so curious to see like how our contribution to education policy changes in the next like 10 to 20 years, because it's so interesting that the last 20 years didn't give the types of results that we were looking for. And even like the inclusion of, I think the policies we saw the most in the last 20 years, or I guess from my perspective from going through school during that time, is trying really hard to include kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds into the same schooling systems as, or schooling environments as those who are better off in their like socioeconomic backgrounds. And it didn't necessarily guarantee that they would necessarily be better in school, because then you had like these academically gifted programs that continue to develop them within schools.
Right.
And you had like the kids who just could not perform at the same levels as the wealthier kids, or the kids who were being like bused in these like magnet schools, etc. And then continue to divide the performance among those students as well. So then you have kids who are in advanced classes in middle school and high school, and they start making those distinctions for honors levels classes. And then those kids just can't perform at that same level. So yeah, maybe they went to that high school that gets all these kids into these great colleges, but it doesn't mean they necessarily got the same out of it
Right.
as some of those other kids.
Yeah, it's a challenging situation. I went through K-12 in the 80s and from the early 80s to the mid 90s. And at that time, that was kind of the beginning of this idea of trying to offer additional services to kids who had advanced abilities. You had the concept of the IEP, the Individual Education Plan, which pretty much any student who is either gifted or is considered learning disabled is supposed to be on. It's basically a plan that's worked out between the school and the parents to kind of help facilitate the trajectory of that student. Then you had this concept of the idea of gifted and talented. And the idea again, and it made sense to a certain degree, because it was the reality of how do we continue to make education challenging, and also how do we advance these kids from a system that had not necessarily been designed with the idea that most students would go to college. Because this was still at a time when most systems, your college student ratio was like 1 to 4. And move them into having more opportunities into college. And that was what I was in when I was starting about 3rd grade all the way up through high school. Didn't mean you didn't have classes with regular students. There were some classes that weren't advanced. or honors level, or whatever the case you want to call it. Today's world, of course, is entirely different. In Wake County, there was a period of time where they did make this effort to try to more successfully integrate school systems. It went from the early 90s till the 2010s. And then that changed. And at the same time, they also had this massive migration of people starting to move into the area. And what the educational leaders of Wake County determined was people wanted, a lot of these parents who were coming in for high-tech jobs, wanted access to specialized programs for their children. So along with building new, what they call comprehensive high schools that are more for traditional students, they also built all these special high schools. And so what you have now is, of course, you have this very broad market of educational opportunities for those who want to take it. But at the same time, as we've learned, that still requires a lot of involvement and advocacy on the part of the parent, particularly knowing who to talk to and knowing what's there. And that's, of course, a hindrance and a stumbling block for a lot of working class people. Not designed to be that way, but it is an unfortunate externality. And so the reality, and of course, there's other challenges that have come out about evaluating the children, how there's biases in that, and other factors. And so there's a situation where school systems have to look at what their options are, and they have to look at what do they do. And my feeling about Wake is that it's kind of spread itself so thin. I don't know what the future holds for Wake. Because in my opinion, it's trying to do too much with the fact that the resources are limited. Wake County has to subsidize its education system directly. It cannot rely upon the state to be the primary fund. That's a lesson that it's still got to learn. And the reality is that once it starts to realize that's what it's going to take to be able to provide the salaries necessary to retain teachers and be able to do other things, they're going to be in a situation where they're going to have to figure out what to do. And that's going to be a big challenge. Are there any other questions with respect to Chapter 7? Okay. So now we're going to talk about Chapter 8, Dynamic Inconsistency, which sounds like a term made by a scientist. So in this example, it gives an example of probably one of the worst federal government screw-ups of the last 20 years. And that was the launch of Healthcare Gov. An example that can't be, that's hard to rival in compared to what it was. I mean, you had this massive program, the concept of universal health care for Americans in some degree, shape, matter, or form finally crosses the finish line. And an effort is made that it's understanding we got to work with modern technology. We got to work with modern technology to facilitate subscriber access. Because it's a voluntary, even though it's required that everybody has health insurance, signing up for healthcare is a voluntary process because we maintain the private insurance. So the federal government says, okay, we need a website for it. They work with a company that nobody's ever heard of, even though they did exist, called CGI. And they build a website and it fails miserably. And it becomes a massive black eye to the program, and kind of leads to a lot of disgruntlement over everything there, along with other issues associated with the design of the program itself. But the website itself, which was the key way for people to be able to access and be able to sign up, even though I always recommended that people talk to actual insurance agents. Even before this website came out, I said, you need to talk to an insurance agent. The reality was that it was a disaster. And it talks in here, it talks in here about some of the challenges involved in that. In reality, the federal agency that's responsible for it, the Centers for Medicaid and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, was actually had in place protocols to prevent this from happening, and actually could have taken action to prevent it from happening, and was considering taking action to prevent it from happening. And they didn't, because it was determined that they were too focused on making sure they got it done on time. What likely would have been required is delay, which would have created some other challenges in policy implementation, but would have ensured more likely that the website would have worked, or a change in vendor, or whatever the case there was. But the reality was, they chose not to implement those actions, and as a result, it was a disaster. And what we're really talking about with dynamic inconsistency, this being an example, is the whole concept that in government, we are supposed to be accountable for what we do. There has to be accountability. And what we mean by accountability is that the idea that everything should be done the way it should be done. But a lot of times that accountability can come into conflict with outcomes. And in this case, the accountability that CMS needed to institute with respect to their vendor got weighed against the outcomes that they were trying to achieve to get the site online, and the outcomes went out. So this, of course, is tied to a lot of issues that happen, and they give three various examples. And we'll talk about each one. First of all, you have commitment problems. Anybody want to define what they think a commitment problem is? Sure.
When the government is promising a certain outcome out of a policy before they can be sure that that's what they'll get out of it.
Yep. Also known as over promising and under delivering. Then there's passing the buck. Somebody online.
I can try.
Sure, go ahead.
Isn't that the one where like they make a decision today that will cost more later, but they don't care because it's easier to do what's easy now?
Absolutely, perfect. And then third one is preserving existing power structure. And that's basically where you weigh the cost of, and that's a little harder, that's a little tougher to define, but in some ways it's also self-explanatory. It's saying, do I really want to weaken myself with my actions? Which runs counter to human nature. Do I really want to put myself that I'm weaker as a result of what I do? So the first one with respect to commitment problems, an example of that is time inconsistency. And in this case, what we're talking about is that ideally, the policy does not take into effect the day typically what happens is a policy does not take effect when it's approved. There's typically a lag. At the federal level, there has to be a lag because regulation has to be written up, they have to be reviewed, they go through a process, and then the policy is. For example, in the case of the Affordable Healthcare Act, the legislation was adopted in 2010, but actual policy did not get implemented for 2 to 3 years. It took 2 to 3 years to build everything out. So the reality is that even there's a tendency that when a policy is introduced, there's a tendency that before something can take effect, people already start adapting to it, already start changing in advance. The example I gave with Ukraine and what's going on with Russia invading Ukraine and how the stock market's reacting, there's a tendency in business markets for investors to go ahead and try to, as quickly as possible, adjust their investment portfolios to take into account expectations going forward. We're seeing that also right now with the fact that there's a lot of concern with respect to the Fed raising interest rates as a means of trying to control inflation. And what investors are trying to do is they're trying to position themselves to be in a better position when the Fed actually does raise interest rates, which will be next month. So what happens is that there's a timing issue. This is talked about a little bit in an example that's given about something called the Phillips curve. What does the Phillips curve tell us? What does the Phillips curve represent?
I could answer that one.
Sure, go ahead.
It's basically that employment have an inverse relationship, but it's like short term. So when there's economic growth, it creates inflation, which should lead to more jobs, so it lowers unemployment.
Correct. So for the last 12, 13 years, and it only ended more recently, the Federal Reserve kind of had a two-pronged focal point with respect to its economic goals. For a long time, it used to just be to look at inflation, and employment and unemployment was considered the trade-off aspect of it. That there is that lower unemployment leads to higher inflation leads to higher inflation leads to lower unemployment and vice versa. In the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, the Fed altered their strategy and decided that what we're actually going to try to do is achieve lower unemployment, because we had significant job losses as a result of the financial crisis, while at the same time trying to keep inflation at a low level. So they had this kind of two-sided coin, this two-sided approach, and they were successful with it for a period of time. Now, it's possible that by trying to minimize inflation with their approach, which was they put a lot of money into the market, but they basically they put a lot of money into the economy, but they put it into financial markets. They rebuilt, they bailed out the banks, they invested in bad debt, they did a lot of that stuff. And the thought was, and it was generally proven correct, was that wasn't creating inflation because it really wasn't putting the money into circulation, simply replacing asset value. And so, as a result, they were trying to build back up the economy while at the same time not trying to put a lot of money out there. So the goal was that hopefully then that money could be used to create jobs, to create more security in the overall economy, to try to create jobs while keeping inflation low. So it did that. It's just that job creation following the recovery period was at a very slow rate. Overall employment, particularly in a lot of parts of the country that were not tech sectors like Raleigh or other sectors, saw very, very minimal increases in employment. Some of them never caught it. Rocky Mountain never caught it with where we were before 2008. We're still below 2008 employment levels. So that was the thought. So to kind of run a little bit counter to this, what we see now, what's currently happening, and what's happened for the last couple of months is more in line with what the Phillips curve suggests, which is that you have this trade-off that's occurring and that inflation has gone up significantly, but also there was significant job growth. In January, you had inflation that hasn't been seen in 40 years, but at the same time, you also saw a significant increase in job gains. And generally speaking, employment's very low right now, overall. Not low and still a little higher than what people want, but the concern is there. So what's happening now is that inflation, for most of us, and for a lot of people, is at an unsustainable level. We're talking, over 7%, which again, we have not seen since the 1980s. And that was at the end of a period of time going back to the late 70s where it was over 10%. And so what they're trying to do is figure out, okay, we need to lower inflation. Well, the mechanism that the Fed uses to lower inflation for the most part is to raise their interest rates. That's typically the tool that's been used. The problem is, as Philipsburg shows us, is that if you do that, that contracts investment, which contracts the opportunity for more jobs. And also has the potential to actually reduce jobs. So and so what's happening now is the last couple of weeks, looking at, unemployment reports, the federal government releases jobless claims on a weekly basis. Those numbers have gone up. There's more people right now. There's been an increase, an uptick in the number of people filing for jobless claims. And that's happening before the Federal Reserve actually raises interest rates. So some employers, not all, plenty of jobs out there right now, there's plenty of openings, but there are employers out there that are looking at the situation saying, how do I keep my costs down? Because it's going to be more expensive for me to borrow. And I'm not necessarily going to be in a growth position. So they're finding ways to reduce costs, to maintain cash and other things. Plus they're dealing with inflation themselves. So another example that's talked about is respect to taxes and savings. What's the relationship that they describe here with respect to taxes and savings? What is the timing aspect that we see when we look at taxes and savings, with tax rates and savings?
So basically, people adjust their saving to what they think the tax rate is going to be at any particular point. So it's like, or what the government announces, so the government says, okay, we're doing 2017 tax cuts, people will adjust their savings in a certain way. But then, so people will make those choices, and the government say, hey, we're in a different spot now, that's a dumb thing to do.
Right, yeah, absolutely. Again, this gets back to an issue that investors, small businesses, large businesses, whatever the case may be, they like certainty in the market, and they like certainty with respect to economic policy. And if taxes are going to go up, they're not going to wait for taxes to go up to make a decision. Do they say more or less? Right. Say again.
So consumers don't say it means that you don't put it on the
No, I think that's right. And we've seen examples of this in the past. The last major tax increase was in 1993. The last major tax increase was at that time. And it was during the Clinton administration. It was seen as a necessary tax increase because we were dealing with significant increase in debt and we were dealing with financial slowdown. And the general thought was that what was going to happen was it was going to result into a pullback in revenues and an economic pullback. Now, it happened to deal with some lucky timing because we were coming out of a recession, and a very short recession. And there was also a massive expansion. We were also about to hit a massive expansion period due to globalization and the rise of internet technology. And so because of that, and also because of the nature, as you talked about, the fact that there was less saving, consumer activity increased, some business investment activity increased, and as a result, actually revenues increased. So it did do what it was supposed to do. But it was not what people thought was going to happen. Generally speaking, people thought that there was going to be less economic activity. And generally speaking, a lot of times when taxes are increased at a certain point, activity slows down. But at the same time, taxes can decrease and people's activity picks up too. It just depends. So next we come to passing the buck, also known as fiscal manipulation. I teach another class on budgeting for another school, And I spent some time talking about this Monday. So this gets to how do you balance a budget? Because the examples that are given in this book deal with state and local governments. And he spends a lot of time talking about Illinois because that's where he lives. And Illinois is a terrible example of fiscal management, of proper fiscal management. And the biggest challenge that many states and local governments are facing has to do with pension liabilities for public workers. Particularly in states with collective bargaining, this is an even bigger challenge. North Carolina is not in the same boat when it comes to pensions. One, we're not a collective bargaining state. And two, in general, we have kept funding our pension plans appropriately. So the state workers plan, the statewide plan for local government employees, which I'm a member of, which is managed by the same people at the state treasurer's office, those plans are in reasonable shape. They're where they're supposed to be. But plans like what's in Illinois, in Kentucky, and also in larger municipalities like Pittsburgh and Chicago are in terrible position. And it gives some examples. What's one example of something Chicago tried to do, of something Chicago did that made absolutely no sense? That gives an example of fiscal manipulation. Somebody online.
You talk about what the parking meters?
Yes, you got it, and Bree got it too. Yeah, so what Chicago did, and it's not the first people to do this, and it won't be the last, was they tried to figure out how do we raise cash, and how do we raise a lot of cash in a one-time. The one thing that governments have is that they have assets. And some of those assets do generate revenue. And so both Chicago, in this case with parking meters, and the state of Indiana with respect to their toll roads, entered into long-term agreements with investment groups or other companies to buy those assets for a significant amount of money. But in both cases, they took a significant discount on the actual value of those assets. Because naturally, no private company is going to buy something for what it's truly worth, because they're in the business to make money. They're trying to buy it for as low a price as possible. And to be brutally honest, governments, and this is the case for all governments, really don't have the expertise and knowledge to be able to properly evaluate the worth of their assets. So, as in the case of parking meters, they said, if I'm correct, that said less than half of its value. They sold the product for less than half of its value. So the company that bought it got a really good deal. And they burned to the money relatively quickly. Even though they committed to a 75-year commitment on the lease, but they spent most of it in less than 5 years. So they may have used that. I think they used it in part to deal with their pension obligations. But as you can tell, it was a short-term fix with long-term consequences. Does anybody know what OPEB stands for? Anybody online? OPEB stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits. And in North Carolina, this is the big elephant in the room when it comes to talking about the fiscal condition of the state of North Carolina. It's also this case for a lot of governments out there. The most expensive liability that most local governments face with respect to the benefits for their retired workers is not their pension, it's their health insurance. Because many jurisdictions, both in in collective bargaining states and non-collective bargaining states like North Carolina have, thank you, Melissa, have guaranteed those benefits beyond the age of 65 when they be eligible for Medicare. My grandmother worked for a public agency in Tennessee full-time for 37 years. So she is eligible for retirement health insurance benefits, which basically minimize her cost of Medicare for the rest of her life. A couple of years ago, she had cancer. It was able to be surgically removed. It was able to be treated. Total cost for that treatment was probably in the neighborhood of around $450,000 to $500,000. Total she paid, total was less than $500. That's not a benefit that any of us in this room are going to have. I'll tell you that right now. Those benefits were made with a lack of future knowledge of where healthcare costs were going to go, the technologies that were going to be available, and the associated costs associated with it. When these programs were developed, first of all, life expectancies were a lot shorter, and there was no idea that they figured that there would be a way to be able to address certain kinds of illnesses. North Carolina does not have significant issues with this. Those are in pretty good shape. But it has a huge unfunded liability with respect to OPEB. And this would require significant attention from the General Assembly. This has been talked about by the current state treasurer, a Republican, and the prior state treasurer, a Democrat. Both of them are finance professionals, both of them acknowledge it, both of them make very passionate cases to say the state legislature needs to take action. Neither of them have been able to see any action so far. Under Democrat-controlled General Assembly or Republican-controlled General Assembly. And that's the issue. Karen, just to answer your question. So there are two different systems. There's the state employee retirement system, and then there's ELGERS, which is the local government employee retirement system. They are separate entities. They are managed, however, together by the state treasurer's office. You are correct that if a COLA, that, for example, when you talk about that, you're right about that with respect to the COLAs, because they are treated separately, but they are joint managed. And of course, obviously, the state contributes to the state system, and then local governments have to contribute to the local system. From a budgetary perspective, when I started with the city of Rocky Mount 16 years ago, in North Carolina, every government employees typically contribute 6 cents towards their pension fund. So that's 6% of our salary. At that time, the amount that we as a municipality contributed to the plan was 4.85%. So the employee was actually contributing more than the employer. Today, we contribute an 11.5% as a city. It has gone up considerably. And that's in order to keep up with the need to continue to increase the portfolio to be able to manage. So it's being professionally managed. It's being done very well, but you can see there's significant costs associated with that. Talking here about political preferences and electoral risk. Mainly, this gets back, I think, to some of the points I made early on. Obviously, one of the challenges that we have in our system in this country is that terms are short. We typically don't try. We have a natural distrust, even though we keep reelecting certain people for a very long period of time. We don't have a lot of trust in the amount of time they actually serve in that office under one term. So members of Congress are elected for 2 years, Senate 6 years, presidents 4 years. And the reality is, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot of time. So it's possible, and it's widely understood, that politicians are obviously going to be focused on making decisions that can benefit them in the short term with respect to getting reelected. And when you think about how a lot of, so these issues that we have, like with pensions, are manifest over a significant period of time. It wasn't one decision that was made 30 years ago. It's a cascading effect of multiple decisions that were made for various reasons. And so they have to calculate and figure out what's the risk of doing something. That's where we get to this whole concept of third rail issues. Social Security is probably the biggest third rail issue in American federal politics. We know that Social Security as a trust-based type entity is non-sustainable. It will eventually become a full pay-go system where the benefits that retirees receive from Social Security will basically be paid for by present generations directly. We're kind of almost there. We technically get there in about 10 years. And that's a significant cost, but the reality is there's only 3 ways to address it. One is to increase the payroll tax, which nobody wants. Second is to raise the eligibility age for future beneficiaries, which is not heavily talked about. And the third is to either reduce or cap benefits. And that actually brings up a significant constituency for a lot of elected officials. One of the more vocal constituencies that's out there. So the solutions are there, but when politicians make the risk calculations in terms of, do I really want to touch this issue, and is it going to affect my ability to get reelected or be able to promote other legislation, do other things, they do the numbers and they go, nope, not going to happen. And so again, we kick that can down. And then there's always this concept known as discounting the future. This idea of looking at the fact that always the belief, again, when you borrow money, this is kind of taking the idea that you have, one of the reasons why you buy a house at a younger age. Why do you buy a house at a younger age if you can? What's one of the reasons you do that?
So it gains value over years.
So it gains in value, but what does it also do? Anybody want to answer online?
Can you repeat the question again?
So what is one, so we've already talked about appreciation of value, but what's one of the other benefits of buying a house and securing a house the younger you are as an adult? If you can. There's equity, yes. Morgan kind of gets it. There's also paying it off, and Morgan gets it. You don't have a rent payment. So yes, Morgan points, which will increase consistently. If you rent, your payment is subject to the market. And I imagine some of you are dealing with that right now. When you buy a house, preferably with a fixed rate mortgage, that cost may increase a little bit as your property taxes go up, but it's fixed. So at some point, as your income goes up, you're getting a savings. So the idea when it comes to debt is there's this kind of mentality that's out there that debt's not that bad of a thing in the future, because theoretically, the whole principle of discounting, if interest rates are below inflation, and if revenues increase at a rate far higher than inflation, in reality, it's not that big of a deal. The reality, of course, is that you're still increasing the debt burden on future generations, and you're still creating an obligation. But it is seen as a benefit by people making these decisions. It's saying, well, if I borrow the money, and again, if I borrow the money, yeah, I may be borrowing it, say at 4%, but in general, that's going to parse it, that's going to spread out the cost. And it's going to make it to where I'm not incurring any huge liability now, I know huge liability later, and eventually you'll get paid. Now that works when we talk about capital investment. When we're talking about infrastructure, when we're talking about fixed assets. It makes sense, like if you're doing water and sewer improvements, or you're building a new fire station, or whatever the case may be, it makes sense to spread that out because there's going to be benefit received across the generation. People 20 years from now are still going to be receiving benefit of the fire station. It doesn't make sense when you're talking about borrowing for operating purposes, which our federal government does now. That's the problem we have with the federal deficit. Federal deficit is not going for capital. It's going to pay for operations. So whatever money is being brought, whatever money is being borrowed on the market, and this gets to another issue with the federal government, in that the federal government is not paying down its deficit. Local, state, and local governments have to pay down their debts, but the federal government is not. The federal government is issuing debt to pay for current things where the impact is pretty immediate and not long lasting, but the effect of that is long lasting. And it's very simple. We're up now to over $30 trillion of gross federal debt. And because interest rates are incredibly low and have been kept incredibly low, we can afford to pay it. But if interest rates get to even a modest level, like say 4, 5, 6%, that'll more than double how much we have to pay in annual debt. And again, we're still not talking about paying down the debt, we're simply talking about making payments. And most of our debt at the federal level is financed in very short terms. It's not over 30 years, it's not fixed over 30 years, it's more fixed over 3, 5 years or less. So that's not to say we couldn't continue borrowing, but there is certainly significant costs associated that will be paid by future generations, along with other obligations that they'll be responsible for. So we come to this last one, influencing future power. And this has to do with the idea of, talks a couple of examples here, but clearly it is, like I said before, it is counterintuitive to human nature for someone to do something that hurts them in the future or weakens them in the future is better. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but when it happens, it's accidental or unintentional rather than intentional. People don't intentionally make decisions to say, I want to be in a position of less power going forward. They don't just think, that's not consistent. And so that naturally can create challenges, because the goal being, a lot of times what we do in public policy, if we're trying to achieve ideal results, is that we're trying to expand power. Now, power is not limited in terms of its size and scope, but it's not going to necessarily grow with the number of people that you have. So it talks here about agricultural subsidies, which have been around for a long time. And I'll just tell you, I'm not a very big fan. A lot of people are. But they still exist. They were the most recent farm bill, which was a little over a year ago, kept them going for a couple more years. When it talks here about agricultural subsidies, what are some of the concerns that exist as a result? Why does this exist? What does it have to do with power? Why do we continue with something that's an inefficient way, with an inefficient use of public resources and creates inefficient economic activity? Why do we do it?
So because the agriculture sector is such a big voting block, they're going to want to keep their power, political power ongoing. So it may be even more like Pareto improvement to shift to something like shift to more manufacturing or shift to other sectors. But a politician's not going to like erode their future political support, even if in the long term it would improve like net efficiency.
Right. So they continue to play the game. And as we know, it creates a situation where it increases the entry cost for new investment. You don't have a lot of people entering in the agriculture field in terms of number of farmers out there, number of farms declining industry. We're seeing some of that here in these areas. I see that in Nash County. I see that in some areas surrounding Raleigh. There are people out there who own massive farming operations, and they factor the subsidies into their economics before they even start planting crop. Gives them an idea of what their minimums are going to be. And the reality is, in some of these people's cases, they're just simply waiting for the numbers to shift to a point where they'll make their properties available for suburban development. Because obviously this area needs more housing. And I agree with that. It needs more housing, and a lot of people want to live out in those areas with close proximity to Raleigh. So we have this situation. So let's take it a step further. This is not talked about in the book, but it's a pretty significant topic. And we have this issue going on right now in North Carolina, if you follow the news, about gerrymandering or redistricting, as the case may be. How, with your understanding of what's going on currently, and I want to preface this by saying that gerrymandering is as old as time is in terms of redistricting. If you look at how some districts were drawn during Democratic administrations, they were pretty crazy too. We had one crazy amoeba district that used I-85 basically as a connector between two areas that were over 100 miles apart, between Charlotte and some other areas. And Republicans are doing the same thing. It's being challenged in the courts, and they still haven't gotten it figured out, at least with respect to Congress. So how does gerrymandering reflect what we're talking about with respect to future power? Karen says dates back to 1812. Yes, go ahead.
If you're gerrymandering and rezoning all these areas to, influence your political power based on where people live, you could create, drastic effects for later on where these areas might struggle to be rezoned. And it also influences communities living there. It's kind of a process to rezone these big areas, but for the length of it, what could influence like elections and other things, so you can maintain your power for longer.
Particularly amongst established constituencies.
Mm-hmm.
There is a strong desire, and this has been the case for many decades, there's a strong desire, particularly in areas that are seeing significant urban expansion, to continue to enable rural areas to maintain strong prominence in elected politics. And so it's very common, and as I said before, this has happened under both Democrats and Republicans, to break up urban areas and try to make it to where their influence with respect to the rural areas of the state, of a given state, and this happens a lot in the South too, but that those rural areas are given power that outweighs their overall presence in terms of population within a given state, and especially from an economic perspective. That happens if they draw county commission districts. That happens with state districts. It can also happen with congressional districts. And the reason why is because there is a lot, these politicians are well established and they represent constituencies that still want to have significant influence in state and federal politics. And again, of course, it comes to the detriment of other areas which are seeing significant increases in population. There's an even worse side when we talk about racial gerrymandering. But there's also the urban-rural aspect, which is a significant situation here in North Carolina. North Carolina has experienced significant growth over the last 20 years and has a major influence. The issue of racial gerrymandering is also something we're dealing with. That was an issue in previous maps that were submitted by Republicans over the last couple of years. And again, it gets to the fact that there are people who are trying to retain power and do not want to do things, even though they're ideal with respect to how policy is, would potentially weaken their power as an organization or a movement or party, as case may be. Are there any questions with respect to Chapter 8? So I was going to do an exercise, but this is taking a little longer than I planned, and I haven't done a break, so I don't want to keep you all any longer. I appreciate everybody's participation. So for our next class on next Thursday, two things. Number one, that class will be on Zoom. It will not be in person, so we will meet on Zoom. Everybody will meet on Zoom. So the text, we're going to focus on Chapter 9, which is the need for information. I will try, I did not post any additional viewing for this week, but I will post some additional viewing for next week. There's also podcast 2 assignment. That email will go out tomorrow morning. It'll be due by 6 p.m. March 3rd. I think you'll find the podcast interesting. And I hope it all goes well. Are there any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
For group projects, when do we find out who gets what topic?
I will send that out tomorrow morning.
Okay, cool. And then I guess when should groups start meeting? Do you think?
Whenever you want,
Okay, gotcha.
whenever you want. So, any other questions? In that case, thank you all very much, and I'll see you all on Zoom next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.